Did you enjoy the $2,000 I've been sending you every month, Mom? Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair like it was the most natural question in the world. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him, because the number didn't make sense, the sentence didn't make sense, and nothing about my life for the past 2 years matched what he had just said. So I looked up at him slowly, careful, measured, the way you look at something fragile you're afraid might break if you react too quickly, and I said, "What money?" The room didn't go silent all at once. It shifted, like the air had been gently pulled out of it, like something invisible had tilted just slightly off balance. And that was when I noticed her, standing behind him near the kitchen doorway, Sophia, my daughter-in-law, perfectly put together as always, her blonde hair falling neatly over her shoulders, her expression composed, almost bored, but her eyes flickered for just a second, not enough for Daniel to notice, but enough for me. Enough to make something cold settle quietly in my chest where confusion had been only seconds before. Daniel frowned, not at her, but at me, like I was the one who had gotten something wrong, like I had misplaced a fact that should have been obvious. The transfers, Mom. I've been sending you $2,000 every month. Since the year after Dad passed. He said it casually, like he was reminding me of a detail I'd simply forgotten, like reminding someone where they left their keys, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the fork I was holding, not enough to make a sound, not enough to draw attention, just enough to anchor myself in something real, because if what he was saying was true, then the past 24 months of my life didn't make sense anymore. $2,000 a month. That was more than enough to cover my medication, the repairs on my car, the heating bills that had kept me up at night during the winter, deciding whether I could afford to turn the thermostat up another 2 degrees or if I should just wear another sweater instead. I had counted every dollar. I had stretched every grocery trip. I had stood in the pharmacy more than once, quietly, putting one prescription back because I could only afford the other. And all that time, according to my son, I hadn't needed to. I didn't look at Sophia right away. I didn't ask her anything. I just sat there, letting the weight of his words settle into place, piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been scattered for years finally, starting to form an image I didn't recognize yet. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, softer than I expected, "I haven't received anything." He stared at me then, really stared this time, confusion sharpening into something more focused, something that didn't quite have a name yet. And behind him, Sophia moved just slightly, shifting her weight, crossing her arms loosely, a small, controlled motion that might have looked casual to anyone else. But to me, it felt deliberate, like she was preparing for something she hadn't expected to happen tonight. "That's not possible," he said, already reaching for his phone, his tone changing, slipping into that efficient, problem-solving cadence he used at work, the one that meant he was about to find an answer, fix a mistake, close a gap. But this wasn't a missed email or a delayed payment. This was 2 years of something that either existed or didn't, and I knew which one I had lived. My assistant handled everything. He continued, scrolling, his brow tightening. Direct deposits, confirmations, all of it. I saw the reports myself. Reports, numbers, proof that existed somewhere, just not in my reality. I finally let my gaze shift to Sophia, and this time, she didn't meet my eyes right away. She smiled instead, that same polished, practiced smile she wore at every family gathering, the one that had always felt just a little too perfect, like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror until every angle was controlled. "Maybe there's just been some confusion," she said lightly, her voice smooth, almost dismissive, like the situation was minor, like it could be explained away with a simple misunderstanding. But she still didn't look at me directly, and that was when I knew, not everything, not yet, but enough to understand that the question Daniel had asked wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the moment the truth had slipped, just slightly, out from where it had been carefully hidden. I didn't argue. I didn't press. I didn't raise my voice or demand answers, because something inside me had already shifted, quietly, firmly, into place. If there was money that had been sent and never received, then it hadn't disappeared on its own, and if it hadn't disappeared, then someone had made sure it went somewhere else, and the only thing more dangerous than a lie is a lie that's been working for a very long time. So I nodded once, slowly, as if I accepted what they were saying, as if I believed this was nothing more than a mistake waiting to be corrected, and I said, "Maybe we should look into it." Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do when the truth begins to surface is nothing at all. Just watch. Just listen. And let the people who thought they were in control show you exactly how far they're willing to go to keep it that way. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to let go of the question that had quietly reshaped everything I thought I understood about my life. And I found myself sitting at the small kitchen table long before sunrise, the same place where I had balanced bills, counted change, and stretched meals for one, staring at the chipped edge of my coffee mug as if it might offer some kind of answer. Because if Daniel had truly been sending that money, then every choice I had made over the past 2 years had been built on something that was not real, and that kind of realization does not arrive loudly. It settles in slowly, like a cold draft you cannot quite locate, but cannot ignore either. I remembered the winter after my husband passed, the first one alone, when the heating bill had climbed higher than I expected, and I had turned the thermostat down to 65 degrees, telling myself it was healthier to sleep in cooler air, even though my hands had gone numb some nights, and I had worn 2 sweaters just to sit still in my own living room. And I remembered standing in the grocery store aisle, comparing prices down to the last cent, choosing store-brand soup over the one Daniel used to love as a child, not because I preferred it, but because it was $2 cheaper, and that difference mattered to me then. It had to matter, because I believed there was nothing else coming. I had never asked Daniel for help. Not once, not even after his father died, because I had raised him to stand on his own, and I believed that meant I should do the same. And maybe that was my mistake, not the independence itself, but the assumption that honesty existed quietly in the background, that what people said matched what they did, that if my son believed he was helping me, then somehow that help would reach me. But it had not, and that meant something had interrupted that path, something deliberate, something consistent enough to go unnoticed for 2 full years. I took a slow sip of my coffee, now lukewarm, and let the silence of the house settle around me. Because this was where the truth always started, not in confrontation, not in raised voices, but in the small, quiet spaces where things did not add up the way they should. I thought about Sophia, about the way she had stood behind Daniel the night before, composed, controlled, careful not to react too quickly, and I realized that I could not remember a single moment when she had ever seemed uncertain in front of me, not until that brief flicker, that hesitation she had not been able to fully hide. And it was not the kind of reaction someone has to a simple misunderstanding. It was the kind of reaction that slips through when something carefully managed begins to shift without warning. Still, I did not rush to judgment, because I had lived long enough to understand that the first explanation is rarely the full one, and that truth, real truth, does not reveal itself all at once. It has to be uncovered piece by piece, often by simply paying attention to what people do when they think no one is watching. Later that morning, I pulled out the folder where I kept my bank statements, the same worn folder I had used for years, and I began to go through them one by one, month after month, checking every deposit, every transaction, every small detail I might have overlooked before, but there was nothing, no unexpected deposits, no unfamiliar entries, nothing that suggested even a single payment had ever reached my account, and I was not surprised, not really, because I had lived that reality already. I had felt the absence of that money in every decision I had made. What surprised me instead was how calm I felt as I closed the folder and set it aside, because the confusion from the night before had settled into something clearer now, something steadier, and with it came a quiet understanding that whatever had happened was not accidental. I did not call Daniel. I did not mention it to anyone. I did not even allow myself to dwell too long on what it might mean, because there was no need to guess when the truth was already somewhere within reach. If money had been sent, then there would be records. If records existed, then someone had seen them. And if someone had seen them, then someone knew exactly where that money had gone. I stood up slowly and rinsed my cup in the sink, watching the water swirl around the porcelain, because sometimes the clearest way to see what is hidden is not to chase it, but to let it come into focus on its own. And for the first time since that conversation, I understood that I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was waiting to see who would reveal it first. I waited 3 days before doing anything that could be called intentional, not because I was unsure, but because time has a way of revealing details that urgency often hides. And in those 3 days I paid attention in a way I had not before, not just to what was said, but to what was avoided, what was redirected, what was quietly controlled. And it started with something small, something that might have seemed insignificant if I had not been looking for it. A phone call that Daniel made while I was in the room, standing near the window as he spoke in that same efficient tone he used for business, discussing accounts, transfers, confirmations, words that would have meant nothing to me a week ago, but now each one felt like a thread I could follow if I was patient enough. "I need a full report," he said, pacing slowly, his back partially turned. "Every transfer, every confirmation, I want to see exactly where it went." And there was a pause, a longer one than expected, and I watched as his shoulders stiffened slightly, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that whatever he was hearing did not match what he believed to be true. And then he said something that settled heavily in the quiet space between us. "That is not possible. Check again." He ended the call a few moments later, his expression tight, controlled, but no longer certain. And when he turned back toward the room, Sophia was already there, not beside him this time, but closer than before, her presence subtle, almost protective, as if proximity alone could influence the direction of his thoughts. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice calm, measured, the same tone she had always used, but now I could hear the precision in it, the careful balance between curiosity and control. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "There is a discrepancy. Some of the confirmations are there, but the receiving account is not matching Mom's records." He glanced at me briefly, then back at her, as if the answer might somehow be found in her reaction rather than in the data itself. Sophia did not respond immediately, and in that small delay, that fraction of a second where silence stretched just slightly longer than it should have, I saw it again. That same flicker I had noticed before, not panic, not even fear, but calculation, the quick, internal adjustment of someone who had not expected the situation to unfold this way. "It could be a clerical error," she said finally, her tone reassuring, almost gentle. "These things happen more often than people realize, especially with automated systems." It was a reasonable explanation, simple, believable, the kind of answer that invites acceptance rather than scrutiny. And for a moment, Daniel seemed to lean into it, his posture easing just slightly, as if he wanted it to be true, as if accepting that explanation would allow everything to return to the version of reality he had been living in. But I did not say anything. I did not challenge her, because I understood something then that I had not fully grasped before, that the truth was not something I needed to argue for. It was something that would reveal itself if given enough space, enough time, enough quiet observation. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the guest room, the door partially closed, voices low but not entirely contained, and I would not have stopped if I had not heard my name, spoken softly, quickly, as if it were something that needed to be handled carefully. "We need to figure this out before he starts digging deeper," Sophia said, her voice no longer carrying the same ease it had in the open. And there was a tension there now, subtle but undeniable, the kind that does not come from confusion, but from awareness. "If it is just a mistake, then it will be fine," Daniel replied, though there was less certainty in his tone than before, less confidence in the simplicity of that explanation. "It is not that simple," she said, quieter now, and I did not need to hear the rest to understand that whatever had been happening had layers I had not yet seen, that this was not a single moment of misdirection, but something that had been maintained over time, carefully, consistently. I stepped away before they could notice me, my movements slow, deliberate, not out of fear, but out of choice, because this was not the moment to confront, not yet. This was the moment to understand, to let the truth continue to surface in its own time. And as I returned to the living room, I realized that the question was no longer whether something had gone wrong, but how long it had been allowed to continue, and more importantly, who had been making sure that it did. I did not bring it up the next day or the day after that, because by then I understood something that had taken me years to learn, that when people feel secure in their version of the truth, they reveal more than they intend, and I had no desire to interrupt that process before it had fully unfolded. So I went about my routine as I always had, quietly, predictably, making coffee in the morning, folding laundry in the afternoon, keeping my movements small and unremarkable, because there is a certain kind of invisibility that comes with age, a way people begin to assume you are no longer paying attention, and I allowed that assumption to settle around me like a coat I had worn for years, comfortable, familiar, and now unexpectedly useful. That afternoon, Sophia asked if I needed anything from the store, her tone polite, almost thoughtful, the kind of question that might have reassured me once, but now I noticed the way she stood slightly angled, not fully facing me, as if already preparing to move on before I answered. And I realized that even her kindness had a rhythm to it, a pattern I had not questioned before because I had never needed to. "I am fine," I said, and she nodded, a quick, efficient motion, already reaching for her phone as she walked away, her attention shifting before the conversation had fully ended, and I watched her go, not with suspicion exactly, but with a clarity that made everything sharper, more defined, like turning the focus on a lens that had been slightly blurred for too long. Later, Daniel came by with a stack of printed pages, reports from his office, spreadsheets filled with numbers that meant something very specific to him, and he spread them out across the dining table as if the answer might reveal itself simply by being visible. "These are the transfer confirmations," he said, pointing to columns and dates, his voice tight with concentration. "Every month, same amount, same schedule," and I leaned forward slightly, not because I needed to understand every detail, but because I wanted to see what he saw, the certainty he had been holding on to, the structure that had supported his belief. The account numbers were there, the dates were there, the amounts were exact, consistent, precise in a way that suggested intention rather than error, and yet none of it had ever reached me. "Maybe the bank made a mistake," he said, though there was less conviction in the suggestion than before, and I could feel the shift happening in him, slow but undeniable, the movement from confidence to doubt, from assumption to questioning. Sophia stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed loosely, watching, her expression neutral, almost detached, and I noticed that she did not step closer, did not lean in to examine the papers the way Daniel had, as if maintaining that distance allowed her to remain outside of whatever conclusion he might reach. "It is possible," she added after a moment, her tone even, controlled. "Financial systems are not perfect," and it was a reasonable statement, one that did not commit to anything, did not contradict, did not confirm, simply existed as an option he could choose if he needed something to hold on to. I did not respond right away, because there was no need to fill the silence, and in that silence, something else began to surface, not in the numbers, but in the way the conversation moved around them, the way explanations were offered before questions were fully formed, the way certainty was gently redirected instead of challenged. "Daniel," I said finally, my voice calm, steady, "what account were the funds sent to?" He paused, just for a second, then looked back at the page, tracing the line with his finger, reading the numbers again as if seeing them for the first time. "It should be yours," he said, quieter now, less certain, and I nodded slightly, because that was the assumption everything had been built on, the foundation that had never been questioned until now. "But is it?" I asked, not sharply, not accusingly, just a simple question, placed carefully, and I watched as that question settled into him, as he looked back at the page, then at Sophia, then back at the numbers again, and for the first time, I saw a hesitation where there had always been certainty. Sophia did not answer, not immediately, and in that brief pause, I saw something shift again, subtle but clear, the moment when maintaining a story becomes more difficult than creating it, and I understood then that whatever had been hidden was no longer fully under control, that the truth had begun to surface in small, undeniable ways, and all I had to do was let it continue. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years, not because I had never needed to, but because I had never suspected that I should. I went to the bank in person, not to confront, not to accuse, but to verify, because there is a difference between what people say exists and what can actually be proven, and I wanted to see the truth in a place where it could not be softened or redirected by conversation. The branch was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from routine, from people moving through their day without expecting anything unusual, and I took a seat across from a young man who introduced himself as Eric, his tone polite, professional, unaware that what I was asking him to check would quietly confirm something much larger than a simple financial question. "I would like to review all incoming transfers over the past 2 years," I said, my voice steady, and he nodded, typing carefully, asking for identification, verifying details, following each step as it should be done, and I watched the screen reflect faintly in his glasses as he scrolled through my records, month by month, line by line, until finally he paused. "There are no recurring deposits matching that description," he said, not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with the clarity of someone reading exactly what is in front of him. And I nodded once, because that was not new information, not to me, but hearing it confirmed outside of my own experience removed the last piece of doubt that might have lingered. Could there have been transfers sent to a different account under my name? I asked, and he frowned slightly, considering it, then checked again, more thoroughly this time, searching for variations, linked accounts, anything that might explain a discrepancy. But after a few moments, he shook his head. "No, ma'am. Everything associated with your social security number is here, and there are no such deposits." I thanked him, stood up, and walked out into the afternoon light, not with anger, not even with surprise, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than anything I had felt so far. Because now the truth was no longer something I was piecing together, it was something that had been confirmed independently, something that existed whether anyone acknowledged it or not. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio, I did not distract myself. I simply let the silence remain, because in that silence, I could finally see the pattern clearly, not just the missing money, but the consistency of it, the way it had been sustained month after month without interruption, without error, which meant it had not been accidental, not once, not ever. When I returned, the house was still, Daniel had stepped out, and Sophia was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her back to me, her phone in her hand, speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment she heard the door close, and she turned quickly, her expression already composed by the time she faced me, as if the conversation had never existed. "You went out," she said lightly, her tone casual, but her eyes moved just slightly, scanning, measuring, and I nodded, setting my keys down with the same calm I had carried with me all day. "I had an errand," I replied, and for a moment, neither of us said anything else, because sometimes the space between words carries more weight than the words themselves, and I could feel that weight now, steady, undeniable. "Daniel is trying to sort things out," she added after a moment, as if offering reassurance, as if maintaining the narrative was still possible if it was presented carefully enough. And I looked at her then, not searching for answers anymore, but recognizing them. "I am sure he is," I said, and my voice did not change, did not harden, did not accuse, because there was no need for any of that now, not when the truth had already begun to stand on its own. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded, turning back toward the counter, her movements precise, controlled, but there was something different now, something just beneath the surface, not visible in what she did, but present in what she did not say. I moved past her slowly, into the living room, and sat down in the same chair I had used for years, the one that had seen me through quiet evenings and long winters, and I realized that I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I understood enough. What I was waiting for now was something else entirely, the moment when the truth would no longer be something I held quietly on my own, but something that could no longer be denied by anyone else. Daniel did not say much that evening, not at dinner, not afterward, not even when the house settled into that quiet stillness that usually brought some sense of comfort, because I could see the weight of something shifting in him, slowly, reluctantly, like a structure that had been standing for too long without question now beginning to show cracks that could no longer be ignored. And he spent most of his time in the study, the door half closed, the soft glow of his laptop spilling into the hallway as he worked through numbers that no longer aligned with what he thought he knew. I did not interrupt him. I did not ask what he had found, because I understood that this part was his to face, that the realization of truth has a different impact when it is discovered rather than delivered, and I had no desire to take that from him. Sophia, however, moved differently now, not in ways that would be obvious to someone who was not paying attention, but in small, controlled adjustments, the way she checked her phone more frequently, the way her conversations became shorter, more contained, as if she was measuring every word before allowing it to be spoken, and I noticed that she no longer lingered in the same room as Daniel when he was reviewing the reports, as if distance might somehow shield her from whatever conclusions he was approaching. The following afternoon, there was a knock at the door, unexpected, firm but not urgent, and when I opened it, I found a man standing there who introduced himself as Mark Reynolds, someone who said he used to work with Daniel's company, specifically in financial operations, and there was something about the way he spoke, direct but careful, that told me he had not come casually. "I hope I am not intruding," he said, his eyes steady. "But I believe there may be something you should be aware of," and I stepped aside, allowing him in without hesitation, because by then I had learned to recognize the moments when information was about to arrive, not by coincidence, but because something had shifted enough to allow it. We sat in the living room, and he did not waste time with unnecessary details. Instead, he placed a small folder on the table, his movements deliberate, controlled, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to reveal. "There were some irregularities flagged internally about a year ago," he said, his voice low but clear. "Nothing that triggered immediate action at the time, but enough to raise concern among a few of us who reviewed the transactions." And I listened without interrupting, because each word felt like a continuation of something I had already begun to see. Only now it was being confirmed from a perspective outside the family, outside the influence of explanation or deflection. "The transfers your son authorized were being rerouted," he continued, opening the folder to reveal printed documents, account details, timestamps, patterns that matched exactly what Daniel had described, except for one crucial difference. The receiving account was not mine, not even close. I felt no shock as I looked at the pages, only a quiet recognition, because the truth had already taken shape in my mind. This was simply the moment it became visible in a way that could not be denied. "Do you know who had access to adjust those routing details?" I asked, my voice steady, and he nodded slightly, not with certainty, but with the kind of understanding that comes from seeing the same pattern repeated enough times to recognize its source. "Access was limited," he said, "but there was one person who consistently handled those processes on your son's behalf, and he did not need to say the name, not out loud, because by then it existed clearly between us, unspoken but fully understood." I closed the folder gently, my hands calm, my thoughts precise, because this was no longer about suspicion, no longer about piecing together fragments. This was confirmation, structured, documented, undeniable, and for the first time since that initial question had been asked, I understood exactly what had been happening, not just the act itself, but the intention behind it, the consistency required to maintain it, the confidence it must have taken to believe it would never be discovered. When Daniel returned later that evening, I did not immediately tell him what I had learned, because timing matters in moments like this, not for the sake of drama, but for the clarity of impact, and I knew that the truth, when presented at the right moment, would not need explanation. It would speak for itself, and all that remained now was deciding when that moment would be. I chose the moment carefully, not because I was afraid of what would happen, but because I understood that truth carries more weight when it arrives without warning, when there is no time to prepare a defense or reshape the narrative, and that evening presented itself with a kind of quiet symmetry that felt appropriate. Daniel at the dining table again, papers spread out in front of him, his expression no longer confident but focused in a way that suggested he was close to something, and Sophia, moving through the kitchen with her usual precision, her movements controlled, her tone measured, maintaining a normalcy that had begun to feel deliberate rather than natural. I walked into the room without hesitation, carrying the folder Mark Reynolds had left with me, not concealed, not emphasized, just present in my hands as if it belonged there, and I took my seat across from Daniel, placing it gently on the table beside his reports. He looked up, noticing it immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he shifted his attention from his own documents to mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because sometimes silence creates a space where truth can enter more clearly than words ever could. "I had a visitor today," I said finally, my voice even, steady, not dramatic, and that was enough to draw Sophia's attention fully into the room, her posture changing almost imperceptibly as she turned toward us, her expression composed but alert, as if she understood instinctively that something had shifted beyond her control. "Someone from your company," I continued, and I saw the moment Daniel connected that statement with everything he had been reviewing, the questions he had been asking, the inconsistencies he could no longer explain, and his hand moved slightly over the papers in front of him, as if grounding himself in what he already knew before reaching for what he did not. What did he say? Daniel asked, his voice lower. Now, more cautious, and I did not answer immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and turned it toward him, allowing the documents to speak first, because there is a kind of clarity in written proof that does not require interpretation. It simply exists, undeniable. He leaned forward, scanning the pages, his eyes moving quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping altogether as recognition settled in, not all at once, but in stages, each line confirming what he had already begun to suspect, but had not yet fully accepted. These are routing records, I said quietly, not to explain, but to guide his focus, and he nodded once, barely, his attention fixed on the details, the account numbers, the dates, the patterns that matched his own reports but led somewhere entirely different. Sophia did not move closer. She did not reach for the papers, and that distance spoke more clearly than any reaction could have, because avoidance is its own form of acknowledgement when the truth is no longer abstract. This does not match Mom's account, Daniel said, almost to himself, his voice strained now, not with confusion, but with realization, and I watched as he turned the page, then another, each one reinforcing the same conclusion, until there was no space left for doubt. No, I said simply, because there was nothing more to add, nothing that needed to be emphasized or repeated. The room held a stillness that felt heavier than silence, the kind that comes when something fundamental has shifted, and for the first time, Daniel looked at Sophia not with assumption, not with trust, but with a question that could not be softened. She met his gaze for a brief moment, then looked away, not dramatically, not defensively, just enough to break the connection, and that small movement carried more weight than any denial she could have offered. Sophia, he said, her name quieter than before, but sharper, more direct, and she exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding in place for far too long. I can explain, she said, her tone controlled, but there was something different in it now, something that had lost its certainty, and I realized then that the truth had reached its point of no return, not because of what I had said, but because of what could no longer be hidden. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I simply sat there, watching, because this was no longer my moment to reveal anything. It was theirs to face, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and allow the truth to take its place without resistance. For a long moment, no one moved. Not Daniel, not Sophia, not even me, because the truth, once placed clearly on the table, has a way of changing the weight of everything around it, and I could see it settling into Daniel's expression, the slow, unmistakable shift from doubt to understanding, from questioning to something far more difficult to accept. Explain, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but no longer uncertain, and it was not a request. It was a line drawn quietly but firmly, one that could not be stepped around or softened with vague answers. Sophia remained still for a second longer, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her posture composed but no longer effortless, and when she spoke, her tone was measured, careful, as if each word had to be chosen with precision. It started as a temporary adjustment, she said, not looking directly at him at first, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the table. There were delays with some internal processes, and I needed to reroute the funds to ensure they were handled properly. And she paused, just briefly, before continuing, I intended to correct it. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any interruption could have, because it forced her to continue without knowing whether her explanation was being accepted or already dismissed. Then things became more complicated, she added, her voice softer now, less certain. And it was easier to maintain the arrangement than to disrupt it. Easier. The words settled into the room in a way that made everything else clearer, because it revealed not just what had been done, but how it had been justified, not as a single mistake, not as an accident, but as a series of choices that had been made repeatedly, consistently, over time. Daniel leaned back slowly, his hand moving away from the papers as if they no longer required his attention, because the numbers had already told him everything he needed to know. You rerouted $2,000 every month, he said, his voice steady. But there was something beneath it now, something restrained, something that did not need to be raised to be understood, for 2 years, and he looked at her directly, not with anger, but with a clarity that had not been there before. And you did not think that was something I should know? Sophia finally met his gaze then, and for a moment, there was no deflection, no redirection, just the recognition that the explanation she had offered was no longer enough to hold the situation together. I was going to fix it, she repeated, but the words had lost their weight now, because intention, when delayed long enough, begins to resemble something else entirely. I did not speak, I did not react, because there was nothing I needed to add to what was already unfolding, and I understood that this moment was not about me anymore. It was about the space between them, the trust that had been assumed, the reality that was now replacing it. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face, not in frustration, but in realization, as if he was finally seeing something that had been present all along but had never been questioned. "Where did it go?" he asked, not sharply, not accusingly, but directly, and Sophia hesitated, just long enough to confirm that the answer mattered more than anything she had said so far. "Into an account I managed," she said quietly, and that was the moment everything settled into place, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden movement, but with a quiet finality that left no room for interpretation. The transfers had not been lost, they had not been delayed, they had not been misdirected by error, they had been taken, consistently, deliberately, and maintained under the assumption that they would never be traced back. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he could not undo, and the room fell into a silence that felt different from before, not uncertain, not questioning, but resolved, because the truth, once fully spoken, does not need to be repeated. I looked at both of them then, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that felt almost distant, because what had been hidden was no longer hidden, and what had been uncertain was no longer in question, and sometimes, that is all that is needed for everything to change. Daniel did not raise his voice, and that was what made the moment feel heavier than anything else that had been said, because anger can pass, it can burn out quickly, but this was something quieter, something that settled deeper, and I watched as he stood up slowly from the table, not abruptly, not in frustration, but with a kind of finality that suggested he had already reached a conclusion he could not step back from. "For 2 years," he said again, not to argue, not to accuse, but as if he needed to hear the length of it one more time, to understand the weight of what had been taken, not just in money, but in trust, in assumption, in the simple belief that what he gave would reach the person he intended it for. Sophia did not respond this time, and her silence felt different now, no longer controlled, no longer strategic, but empty in a way that suggested there was nothing left to shape, nothing left to redirect, and that was when I realized that the version of events she had maintained so carefully had finally reached its end, not because she had chosen to stop, but because it could no longer continue. I stood up as well, not quickly, not to match his movement, but because there was nothing left for me to sit through, nothing left to observe, and I placed my hand lightly on the back of the chair, grounding myself in something familiar as I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, the way I had not in a long time, not as a child, not even as a son, but as a man who had just seen something clearly for the first time. "You believed you were helping me," I said, my voice calm, not bitter, not accusing, because the truth did not need emotion to give it weight, and I believed I needed nothing. And he looked at me then, his expression shifting, not with guilt, but with something more complicated, something that carried both regret and realization, because we had both been living in different versions of the same reality, and neither of us had questioned it until now. "Mom, he began, but I shook my head slightly, not to stop him completely, but to let him know that whatever he was about to say was not what mattered in this moment, not yet. "This is not about what you intended," I said quietly. "It is about what was done," and the words settled into the room with a clarity that did not invite argument, only acknowledgement. Sophia shifted slightly then, as if she might speak, as if there was still something she could offer to change the direction of the moment, but she did not, and I understood that whatever explanation she had relied on was no longer enough to stand against what had been revealed. I reached for the folder, closing it gently, not out of secrecy, but because it had already served its purpose. The truth inside it no longer needed to be displayed to exist, and I turned toward the hallway, moving slowly, deliberately, not out of weakness, but out of control, because there is a difference between leaving a situation and stepping away from it, and I had no intention of running from anything that had just been brought into the light. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked, his voice softer now, uncertain in a way I had not heard before, and I paused, just for a moment, not turning back immediately, because I wanted the words I said next to be clear, simple, and impossible to misunderstand. "I am going home," I replied, and when I turned to face him again, I could see the question forming in his expression, the realization that what I meant was not just the house I had been staying in, but something more defined, more independent, something that existed outside of the assumptions that had been made for me. "You should not have had to go without," he said quietly, and there was something genuine in his voice now, something that had not been shaped by expectation or convenience, but by understanding, and I nodded slightly, not to accept the apology he had not fully spoken, but to acknowledge that he finally saw what had been there all along. "No," I said, my tone steady, "but I did, and I let that truth stand on its own, without decoration, without emphasis, because it did not need anything more." I walked past them then, through the quiet hallway, toward the front door, the same door I had entered so many times without question, without hesitation, and as I stepped outside into the evening air, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not relief, not even satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when something hidden is finally seen for what it is, and I realized that what had been taken was not just money, not just comfort, but time, and time is something no one can return, no matter how clearly the truth is revealed. And as I closed the door behind me, I understood that sometimes the most powerful ending is not a confrontation, not a resolution, but a quiet decision to no longer remain where you were never fully seen to begin with.